Well, it's the last week of class. I have to say, this has been a really good class. Like, you guys have done so well on like your papers and the exams and things like that. So congratulations. Keep up the good work this fall semester. I did want to cover the last portion of the class, which is basically economic policy. It's called spending and taxing, but it's really economic policy. And so I wanted to talk about these things, and I put them in the notes. But Adam Smith and his book, The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776, and then Karl Marx and his book, The Communist Manifesto, written in 1848, and then John Maynard Keynes and his book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, written in 1936. And we're also going to talk about monetary policy, which is handled by the Federal Reserve, fiscal policy, which is handled by Congress and the President, and then a little bit about inflation and unemployment. And so let's just start off with Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations. And basically what Adam Smith was saying in The Wealth of Nations was, let the free market handle the economy. We shouldn't have the government interfering in it. And of course, 1776, of course, is the same year that we had our Declaration of Independence. And so he was basically saying, if you allow for the free market to handle things, then that will be what will drive the economy. Also, let companies, let even countries specialize in the things that they do best. And he even talked about like this pin factory. And in the pin factory, the idea was, let somebody like create the metal, let somebody shave the metal, let somebody sharpen the pins. And that way they'll become really good at it, and you'll be able to be much more productive, which is basically, you know, what we thought about later on as far as like building cars and building phones and things like that. Have people specialize within a factory, and that's normally going to help pay off. He did say that there was going to be unscrupulous people in the economy, and so the government would have to have like some watchdogs out there to pay attention to that. But otherwise, let the free market play its course. And so if you think of things like cell phones, you know, like at one time we had the BlackBerry cell phone, and the BlackBerry cell phone was what everybody was using at the time. Then in 2007, they introduced the iPhone and the touchscreen and all that sort of thing. And you know, the BlackBerry phone was out the door. The company went from like $150 share price to like $7 share price. And then Apple, of course, took over the market, and their stock went from like $20 to $350. And so that was like the good example of where the stock market and the free market basically was involved with like whatever the consumer wanted. And so it's also based on supply and demand. The more demand there is, the more price you could charge. And so like, of course, that's why iPhones are much more expensive than maybe like a Motorola phone, because they're just more in demand, and so they can charge a higher price. Karl Marx, he was the Communist Manifesto, and I know we talk about, oh, communism is terrible and things like that. But Karl Marx did have a good point when he was talking about the workers being taken advantage of by the owners. And so I'm going to try to draw like a little bit of a graph here to just sort of demonstrate what Marx was talking about. And so he was talking about, in an economy, you're going to have peaks and valleys, you know, where there's going to be recessions and there's going to be unemployment and things like that. And what he was talking about is you're going to have these types of things going on where there's peaks and valleys. And what he said was, the employer or the owner of the business is going to be hiring people here, and the people are going to continue to produce the products, and then eventually they're going to get to this point, and the employer is going to say, hey, we don't need you anymore. We're going to fire you because we don't need as many employees anymore. But at the same time, the company has built up all this inventory, and so as building up all this inventory, eventually the company still has inventory, and they're going to be able to continue to sell that inventory, but the workers are now out of work. And so the owner's still making money because he had built up this inventory, and now these workers are out on the street. And so Marx's thing was, it's unfair that these owners take advantage of the workers. And so we need to do something to make this a little bit more fair, and the government ought to step in and try to do something about that. And so his idea was have the government step in, and they're going to help get rid of these peaks and valleys, and the government can do more regulation as far as the as far as the companies go, as far as the economy goes. And then, according to him, the companies could even be taken over by the government, and then the government would be able to pretty much make things so that we don't have like these peaks and valleys in the economy, and then the government can sort of set the amount of production that needs to be done, and then they're not going to have to lay people off. And so it's not so much that he was like, oh, we have to take over industry. He was just saying that it's unfair the way that the system is set up, where the owner is able to sort of take advantage of the worker, and the owner is always going to make money, and sometimes the worker's not going to make money. John Maynard Keynes, in his book General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money in 1936, was really coming out during the Depression. And Roosevelt took a look at this. Franklin Roosevelt took a look at his theories and said, that's what the government needs to do. The government needs to step in difficult times and try to help the economy. And then once the economy improves, then the government can step back out. And so Keynes said that you should use monetary policy and fiscal policy to manage the economy. By the way, it's totally an example of what's going on right now. And so the idea behind this was, okay, the economy is suffering right now. We have high unemployment. What things can the government do to try to improve the economy? And so one thing they said was, the Federal Reserve, they can lower interest rates. If they lower interest rates, it's going to encourage people to buy more products. Somebody's going to maybe go out and buy a house, or somebody's going to go out and buy a car, because now they can afford it because interest rates have gone from 8% to 4%. And so the Federal Reserve can push interest rates lower. We'll get to the other part with the money supply, but certainly the Federal Reserve also can influence the money supply. On the other side of it, Congress, what can they do to try to help improve the economy? And the two tools that they have are spending and taxing. And so when you take a look at what Congress can do, and back at that time, certainly Congress and the president did increase spending. And so they increased spending, and they said, whatever projects we can come up with, we're going to do, and we're going to put people back to work. Even if it's like a project that maybe we don't even need very much, but we're going to try to do something along those lines. And so all sorts of projects came through, whether it was like building a new water port, or building a new airport, or schools, or improving infrastructure for roads, or improving electric infrastructure. And so they put all sorts of these things into place so that they could hire people. And then once they hire those people are going to be getting paid. They're eventually going to need to buy things. They're going to need to buy clothes. They're going to need to buy food, cars, and that's going to reverberate throughout the economy in a multiplier effect. And with that multiplier effect, you're going to have an improving economy where the store that sells the jeans are going to have to hire people. They're going to have to hire more people to make the jeans. The people who are building the cars are going to have to hire more people. And so on and so forth down the line, where it's going to multiply it within the economy. So that was sort of Keynes's idea with that. And then also, as far as that side goes, the taxing part. What if we cut taxes, and by cutting taxes, we're going to put more money into people's pockets. The more money that people have in their pockets, they're going to be able to go out and buy things. And so let's cut taxes from 40% to 20%. That's going to give people a lot more money to go out and spend. And so during these tough economic times, that's sort of the idea. Keynes also said, eventually, the economy is going to turn around, and then you've got to cut off all that stuff. You've got to stop spending so much. You have to increase interest rates a little bit. You have to maybe increase taxes a little bit, because you don't want the economy to heat up too much, because if it heats up too much, then you start creating inflation. If you start creating inflation, then there's a more urgent need to start increasing taxes and increasing interest rates at a pretty rapid pace. And so those are things that, certainly they do keep an eye on. The other part I mentioned, and I've talked about this in other videos, was the idea of the money supply through the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve right now is really pumping in trillions of dollars into the marketplace. And so the Federal Reserve has been buying corporate bonds, they've been buying municipal bonds, that's bonds sold by state and local governments. They've been buying U.S. Treasuries, so the bonds that are sold by the federal government, and the Federal Reserve has been stepping in and buying all sorts of those things. By doing that, they're saying, hey, we'll buy these other bonds and you guys can invest in something else, like the stock market. And so we know how the stock market's been going crazy lately. And part of it is because there's all this money floating around, and the Federal Reserve is saying, we'll buy all these bonds, and so don't worry about that. You guys just go invest in corporations or something like that. And so we've seen like a big jump in those sort of things. And so that's basically what the Keynesian theory was. And for sure, that's what we're in these days in the United States. The Republicans and the Democrats argue, like how much should be put into the market, or how much interest rates should be cut, or how much extra spending should be created, or taxes should be cut. But regardless, they're both involved with what we would call Keynesian theory, with monetary and fiscal policy to help improve the economy. Inflation and unemployment, of course, this pandemic has thrown these things into a tailspin. You don't know like what's going to happen with unemployment, if these jobs are going to come back. But when you have like prolonged high unemployment, then you're talking about what's called an economic depression. So hopefully our unemployment rate will, start to turn around. And I know it's gone down a little bit, but we don't know what's going to happen with the reclosing of some of these businesses. Inflation so far, we're in pretty good shape. Inflation basically below 2%. And by the way, the Federal Reserve doesn't want zero inflation. They want to have some sort of inflation. And so they're certainly going to have some sort of a way to slow things down if inflation starts coming around. And usually it's increasing interest rates, at least on the Federal Reserve side. The federal government is spending so much money. And this year, we're probably going to have a $5 to $7 trillion budget deficit with the federal government, which means that could easily create inflation unless the Federal Reserve keeps buying it and sort of like pushes back some of this stuff. But even with them buying it, it could create inflation. And so it's something that we sort of have to keep an eye on. So those are certainly important issues. One other thing that I did mention in like our notes, and I talked about this, like the austerity program, where if you have these things taking place in the economy where you've got, high spending from the government, sometimes they have to like start cutting back on that. And what happened in the European Union was the country of Greece was spending too much money, and then they kept borrowing and borrowing from the European Union. Finally, the European Union said, you have to do something to get your own economy under control. You have to go under an austerity program, which would include increasing taxes and cutting spending, which normally you wouldn't do during tough economic times, but Greece is just spinning out of control, so they put these measures in place. They really haven't improved much. They've really been in a depression for years because they can't get their unemployment numbers down, but they've at least made some changes as far as the unemployment numbers go a little bit lower, and at least slow down this out of control spending and borrowing that they had in place. But an interesting look at like how things can change also. And for the United States, it's not a big deal because we can borrow as much money as we want. We don't have anybody putting any constraints on it. But in the European Union, you can't do that because they're part of the Eurodollar, and so they put constraints on it. And some of those countries that have like more difficult economies should have never gotten it in the first place. Although they have gotten all these bailouts, so that's worked. And yesterday, the European Union did approve a $2 trillion bailout program, mostly for those countries that are struggling, like Italy, Spain, and Greece. And so they've got even more money coming that will sort of be pushed into their economy and hopefully turn things around. So that's just a quick overview of economic policy. I know we've got our final exam this week, and then if you haven't gotten your papers in lately, just get those in. Keep up the good work. It's been awesome having you guys in class. I really enjoyed like reading your papers, and I hope you have a great fall. Stay in touch if you need anything, and hope to see you soon.